Yesterday, we were talking about the causes of the U.S. Civil War. We started off with the origins of the war and political issues is the IB subject we're beginning with. And we left off with the aftermath of the Mexican War. And we talked about effects for Mexico, such as being weakened in the long term, such as the instability, the loss of land. With regard to the United States, we considered the acquisition of a large part of land beyond the Louisiana Purchase. For the first time, a massive acquisition of land that the Missouri Compromise had not addressed. And one of the main things that is a theme for this unit is the spectrum of position of politicians and people towards the extension of slavery to the territories. The extension of slavery to the federal territories is one of the chief issues we need to focus on. And remember, on the one extreme, you have those who would argue slavery follows the flag and that all federal territories should be open to slavery. On the other end of the spectrum, you had those who would argue that slavery should be blocked from the territories and prohibited from all the federal territories for a variety of reasons, some of which were those we'd be familiar with today, a moral opposition to slavery. There was also blatant racism at play. The fact that they don't want the extension of slavery, but they want to maintain slavery in the South because many Northerners did not actually want slavery to end, did not actually want African Americans to then leave the South and move to the North and live in their neighborhoods and communities. Their moral obligation or moral opposition did not go that far. And I would also say some of their opposition, get this through your head. This is, I think, what we always love to have a good guy. We always love to say the North was in the right. We believe slavery is so universally wrong today, and we put our view onto those in the past. There were those who made that argument, and we fixate on them. But the majority who would oppose slavery in the territories, a lot of it had to do with economics. They, or their children, or their families, or their friends wanted to move west to the territories and have access to the free, cheap land. When slave owners moved into territories, they were very wealthy and could buy up vast tracts of land. Whites who didn't own any slaves could not buy huge tracts of land. We say, what if you were really rich and you were from the North? But because land was so available, free people did not work for other planters or farmers. You see what I'm saying? So without slavery, there really weren't many plantations in the sense where you had many farm hands working for you. That was not very common because people would prefer to have their own farm than be a farmhand for someone else. And so forcing people in slavery to do it was one of the only ways to do it. And so by keeping the big landowners, the slave owners, out, it was economically advantageous for any whites who wanted to move in to those territories. So there were those who wanted to block it. Some of it, I'm not trying to say there were no moral obligations or moral opposition, but a big part of it was economic and self-motivated as well. We can't make them out to be universally the white knight good guys and say they were always just trying to do the right thing, because then that sort of misrepresents it. In the middle, so we have those that want slavery in all the territories, those that want to block it, and in the middle, you have a couple of positions. You have those who argue that just like all the other states, they ought to be subject to popular sovereignty. Whatever the people in those states choose when they submit their constitution to Congress should be up to the people of that state. That's the genius of federalism, many would argue. As we've talked about time and time again when discussing the U.S. government, is the genius of federalism. That each state could kind of make its laws more or less in tune with its own values. There were also those that then in the middle wanted to draw a line and said that was the best solution. That might be best exemplified maybe by Henry Clay with his work a little bit on the Missouri, but especially on this great compromise of 1850, the idea of draw a line, that the Congress will decide where slavery can go and can't go and draw some line based on political realities and horse trading. And we'll give you this if you give us that, as if it's some sort of bargaining process. And in the middle, you might also say then there were people who would argue we shouldn't deal with this at all. There'll be those who will promote and pass what's called a gag rule in the House eventually, where they will refuse to take up any bills and discuss issues of slavery because it's so divisive and it causes so much division among its members. So those are the three positions, but on the fringes, on either extreme, remember, that out beyond the traditional free soil and what will become the Republican position of non-extension of slavery to the federal territories. You should be familiar with that phrase and write that down. Non-extension of slavery to the federal territories. That is the Republican position of Abraham Lincoln that causes the South to secede, that scares them so much. Simply non-extension to the territories. Not ending slavery, not forcing it on the South, but non-extension. But there were those on the fringes of the Republican Party and on the fringes of Northern society who were in fact abolitionists. And we've read about William Lloyd Garrison, for example. Another extremist, the extremist of the extreme, would be the John Brown, for whom we're going to have a pair of readings coming up soon. Those who want to absolutely end slavery and argue slavery has no right to exist, even in the South, even where the state governments sanction it and it has a long history. It is wrong and does not have a right to exist there and therefore should be ended. That's a fringe, small group. Put a star by this, that again, time and time again, is a misconception even brilliant IB students make, is, oh, every Northerner was an abolitionist, every Northerner believed in equality, every Northerner had all these great moral reservations just like we have today, and it's just not the case. This is a fringe, extreme group, especially in the 1850s, until the war gets well underway, do people's attitudes change. And on the converse side, on the pro-slavery side, you're beginning to even see some hint. It's a smaller group even than the abolitionists, but some hint, some whiff of people who are beginning to argue that northern states maybe shouldn't be allowed to ban slavery. A much smaller group, much more theoretical, but some northerners almost use that as a fear. They would say the way that some southerners want to go, that is the position they'll inevitably be led to. Especially with the saying like slavery follows the flag. Well, is it going to follow the flag into Massachusetts, into Pennsylvania? And that was a grave concern. So that is the recap and sets the stage for the problem presented by this massive influx of land. I know we're spending a lot of time here, but it is the central issue. Again and again, students forget that it's not just slavery, it's not just secession, but the slavery in the territories and these very different positions on what exactly should be done are at the heart of the cause of the war. And so when California very quickly applies for statehood, the trouble is this, is that Southerners had their eyes there. That it was the plum of the Mexican cession, the place with the greatest opportunities for plantation agriculture compared to the mountains and deserts of much of the rest of the cession. And so the fact that it so very quickly became a free state, or demanded, proposed to be a free state, in response to the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, caused consternation among all parties. And this is Henry Clay's last sort of swan song, if you will, his last major action on the national stage here. We have already been talking about the issue of slavery and politics, how there are very few abolitionists. Most people are focusing on the expansion of slavery to the territories. This just explains the specific position of certain individuals. Henry Clay, where does he fall on that spectrum that I so deliberately and belaboredly pointed out? Where does Clay fall? on that spectrum.
Doesn't he want to end it everywhere, but then ship them all back to Africa?
To end them everywhere but ship them to Africa, that's in the mix of his mind. I suppose once he hits his stride in his political career, as I alluded with the Missouri Compromise, and particularly with this compromise, he fits into the middle group, but which part of the middle group?
The non-extension.
No, not non-extension.
Draw the line.
To draw the line, that the federal government will draw a line so that everyone can drop it. Because if we set a boundary, we set the line, then we can move on and not let this tear the country apart, is his theory. So he urges compromise. Draw a line, make a compromise. Calhoun, who is the former vice president, former Jackson supporter, turned Jackson enemy, turned supreme states' rights advocate, he argues that now, since the North has a greater population, a greater banking interest, and greater wealth, that Northerners should simply realize why Southerners feel so threatened. Because the Southerners feel their way of life and their section is threatened by the strength of the North. And therefore, since the North could do what it wanted if it wanted to, that Northerners should be more inclined to give in and permit Southerners to feel more secure in their way of life. And so that, in general, Northern politicians should give in to the South. Daniel Webster, I believe he's from Massachusetts also, supported compromise despite his own beliefs, and was, for a long time, he was an ardent supporter of abolition and particularly of non-extension, but he goes in with Clay and urges compromise. Here's a man who, by all rights, was believed to be the leading candidate for the 1860 election, which Abraham Lincoln would win this primary and win the election. But he was considered the lead Republican. He was really considered, William Henry Seward. Seward was considered the heir to Henry Clay, really. He was a lot like Clay, kind of urbane statesman, sophisticated, and which differed from Clay in the sense that Clay had more of a Western flair versus Seward was a New Yorker. But in the sense that he was a powerful speaker and was well respected, he'll kind of pick up and for the Republican Party for a time be what Henry Clay was for the Whigs. Seward argues that it doesn't matter what the Constitution says. Everyone is arguing, what does the Constitution say? What does the law say? What does tradition say? He argues there is a higher law than the Constitution. There is right and there is wrong, and slavery is in the wrong. And therefore we should not compromise. We should not do really anything that promotes slavery in any way. William Henry Seward. There's an excellent book by Doris Kearns Goodwin called Team of Rivals that explains the story of Lincoln and Seward and a handful of other candidates for the 1860 Republican nomination, and explains very carefully how Seward bitterly resented Lincoln at first, but then went on to serve as his Secretary of State and probably became Lincoln's closest friend and confidant during his presidency. And they developed a very strong friendship, and he grew greatly to respect him. The compromise is this. Henry Clay wrote a full, what's called an omnibus bill, which means you stack together several different propositions and put it all together as a great compromise. It would eventually have to be broken up and rewritten as 5 separate bills, but eventually all 5 passed separately, even though they couldn't all pass together. 1, California would be admitted as a free state, which would seem to tip the balance. That's I'll just get through these very quickly. The rest of the Mexican cession would be open to popular sovereignty. Texas would lose its land claims in the West. The slave trade would be abolished in Washington, D.C., and the fugitive slave law would be strengthened.